Hey everyone, today we're going to be talking about four of the most evil moms you can imagine. Before we start, remember to hit like and subscribe and also the notification bell and turn on all notifications. Also, don't forget to drop a comment saying where you're listening from. In the 1970s, Schenectady, New York, was a working class town, home to families who built their lives around the massive General Electric plant. Among them were Marybeth and Joseph Tinning, a young couple who, on the surface, seemed to be living an ordinary life. They married in 1965 and soon began to build a family, but their home would become the epicenter of a tragedy so relentless and so profound that it defied all explanation, earning the sympathy of an entire community. Over 14 years, a dark shadow fell over the Tinning household, and one by one, their 9 children perished. The cascade of loss was staggering. It began in 1972, a year of almost unimaginable grief. On January 3rd, their third child, Jennifer, died at just 8 days old from what doctors called hemorrhagic meningitis. Only 17 days later, 2-year-old Joseph Jr. was rushed to the hospital and pronounced dead on arrival, with the cause listed as cardiac arrest. Then, less than 2 months after that, on March 2nd, their firstborn child, 4-year-old Barbara, died after falling into a coma. Doctors attributed her death to an extremely rare condition known as Ray's syndrome. In the span of just 87 days, 3 of their children were gone, but the pattern didn't stop. The following year, their son Timothy was born, only to die 19 days later. His death was attributed to SIDS. In 1975, 5-month-old Nathan died from what an autopsy called acute pulmonary edema. In 1979, 3-month-old Mary Frances also died, another victim of supposed SIDS. A year later, 3-month-old Jonathan passed away, his cause of death undetermined. The community rallied around the Tinnings, viewing them as the victims of a cruel genetic lottery, a family cursed by a 1-in-a-billion medical anomaly. Marybeth, in particular, became a figure of immense public sympathy, the grieving mother forced to endure the unendurable, burying one small casket after another. This narrative of tragedy was far more palatable than the alternative, an idea so monstrous it was almost impossible to contemplate, that the grieving mother was the curse herself. The shared belief in a medical tragedy created a powerful shield of denial, a collective psychological defense that allowed a predator to hide in plain sight. And beware, this may be one of the most disturbing stories you've ever heard, not just for the crime itself, but for the final outcome and where things stand today. Behind the public mask of the tragic victim was a woman whose life was built on a foundation of profound insecurity. Born in Duanesburg, New York, Marybeth grew up feeling like an unwanted child, a sentiment she claimed a relative once told her directly. She would later claim that her parents hit her with a fly swatter and would lock her in a closet, though these allegations only came out much later. Of course, that's not to say they aren't true, but she only started making these claims when she was incentivized to do so. According to her, this upbringing instilled in her a deep-seated sense of worthlessness and a desperate, lifelong craving for attention and validation. Her marriage did little to fill this emotional void. She met Joseph Tinning on a blind date, and they married in 1965. And trust me when I say it, this guy is going to be a real unsung villain of this deeply disturbed story. Joseph was consistently described as a shy, passive, and emotionally inarticulate man who was unable to provide the support and intimacy Marybeth craved. In 1974, during a period of intense marital turmoil, Marybeth crushed prescription pills and put them in Joseph's grape juice. He was hospitalized with a near-fatal case of poisoning, yet he declined to press charges against his wife. Notably, for reasons which aren't clear to me, This incident didn't tip off the authorities to keep a closer eye on her as her children perished one by one. For nearly a decade, the genetic flaw theory provided a convenient, if tragic, explanation for the string of deaths in the Tinning family. It was a narrative that doctors, neighbors, and even law enforcement could accept. But in 1981, an event occurred that should have shattered that theory beyond repair. In 1978, the Tinnings had adopted a newborn son named Michael. As he wasn't their biological child, he couldn't have inherited any genetic disorder from them, which goes without saying. What's more important is that the odds of him being born with the exact same sort of issue that struck all their biological children ought to have been vanishingly low. Simply stated, his life should have been the definitive counter-evidence to the family curse, and an affirmation that this troubled couple didn't harm anyone. Instead, in March 1981, 3-year-old Michael died. Marybeth brought his lifeless body to a doctor, claiming he simply wouldn't wake up. The official cause of death was listed as bronchial pneumonia. The death of a non-blood relative should have immediately triggered a full-scale investigation and a re-examination of all the previous deaths. It was a logical impossibility for an adopted child to die from his adoptive parent's genetic defect. Yet, inexplicably, no major investigation was launched. I'll just let that one sink in for a second. This catastrophic failure of oversight revealed the system was more invested in protecting its own prior conclusions than in responding to new, contradictory evidence. Notably, a number of physicians had raised suspicions and concerns and called for full inquiries, but were silenced. The system, in effect, chose to protect itself from the implications of its own past failures, and in doing so, it left Marybeth Tinning free to strike again. The final act began on August 22, 1985, with the birth of Tammy Lynn, the Tinnings' 9th child. 4 months later, on December 20th, she was dead. This time, however, things were different. A formal investigation was finally launched. A laboratory test confirmed what should have been suspected all along. Tammy Lynn had died from asphyxia by suffocation. On February 4th, 1986, Marybeth Tinning was brought in for questioning. She confessed to smothering Tammy Lynn with a pillow. She also admitted to eliminating 2 of her sons, Timothy and Nathan. Her reason was chillingly simple. They were crying, and their crying made her feel like an inadequate mother, so she shut them up permanently. This confession opened a window into a deeply disturbed mind, one that many experts now believe was afflicted with a rare disorder known as Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This is a condition where a caregiver secretly fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care to garner attention and sympathy for themselves. Tinning's life was a textbook profile. Her background as a nursing assistant and ambulance worker gave her a familiarity with medical settings. She reveled in the role of the tragic figure, becoming the center of attention for doctors, friends, and a sympathetic community. A pastor who had counseled her previously noted her profound lack of self-esteem and her constant, desperate attempts to gain acceptance. Marybeth Tinning wasn't motivated by a simple desire to be free of her children. She was driven by a pathological addiction to the role of the grieving mother. The children themselves weren't necessarily even the targets of her rage, but the instruments she used to satisfy her desperate need for unlimited attention and sympathy. The legal system, faced with a case spanning over a decade with little remaining physical evidence, made a strategic decision. Prosecutors focused the case solely on the slaying of Tammy Lynn, for which they had a confession and forensic proof. While her admissions about the 2 other children were used to show intent, she was only tried for this one case. Her defense argued the confession was coerced, but in July 1987, A jury found her guilty, and she was sentenced to 20 years to life. For years, Tinning maintained her innocence. She was denied parole 6 times between 2007 and 2017. Finally, in July 2018, on her 7th attempt, a 75-year-old Marybeth Tinning was granted parole. She was released in August after serving over 30 years, a decision that was met with fury from politicians and the public, and basically anyone with a heart. The conclusion to her story is yet another extremely unsettling part of this twisted case, and it brings us back to her husband. Upon her release, Marybeth Tinning went home to live with her husband Joseph in their house in Duanesburg. This is the same man she once tried to eliminate, and a man who had his 9 children taken by this monster. Some have questioned if the authorities appropriately investigated the husband's potential involvement in the crimes of his wife, though there are no formal allegations against him. At present, Marybeth Tinning is still alive in that house, with that same spouse, in that house where all her children were slain. It was a performance that captivated and horrified a nation, and later the world. On October 25, 1994, a frantic 23-year-old mother from Union, South Carolina, told police a story that tapped into every parent's deepest fears. Susan Smith claimed that while stopped at a quiet intersection, a mysterious black male had forced her from her Mazda protege and sped away, taking her 2 small sons with him. For 9 agonizing days, America watched as Susan made tearful televised pleas for the safe return of 3-year-old Michael and 14-month-old Alex. Her face, etched with what looked like unbearable grief, became a fixture on the evening news. The images of her 2 smiling boys were flashed across every screen, and a wave of national sympathy poured into the small southern town as a massive manhunt got underway. The story was a perfect storm of tragedy, innocent children, a distraught mother, and a dangerous, shadowy figure. It was a narrative the public readily consumed, a heartbreaking drama playing out in real time. But the twist was that it was all a lie. The supposed perpetrator that Susan Smith created was both specific and chillingly generic, a black man in a knit cap. Little did the public know, the true perpetrator was the one standing before them, live on TV. While the nation was swept up in the emotional tide of the case, investigators were quietly applying cold logic to Susan Smith's story. From almost the very beginning, her account raised red flags for law enforcement. Detectives were skeptical within the first 2 days, finding it peculiar that a carjacker, whose primary goal is stealing a vehicle, would complicate the crime by taking 2 small children. Their suspicions were strong enough that they began searching nearby lakes and ponds, including John D. Long Lake, long before Smith confessed. She was subjected to a polygraph test just 2 days into the investigation, which she failed, further cementing their doubts. The critical flaw in her story, the detail that would ultimately shatter her entire fabrication, was mundane and technical. Smith claimed she was stopped at a red light at an otherwise empty intersection behind a local textile mill. Investigators, however, discovered that the traffic light at that specific location was operated by a pressure plate on the intersecting road. It wouldn't have turned red for Smith unless another vehicle was present to trigger it. Her insistence that no other cars were around made her story a physical impossibility. This single, unassailable fact exposed the foundation of her lie. While the country was focused on the high drama of a kidnapping, the case was being cracked by the simple mechanics of a traffic signal. After 9 days of mounting pressure and intensifying scrutiny, the deception collapsed. On November 3, 1994, investigators confronted Smith with the inconsistencies in her story. Union County Sheriff Howard Wells employed a strategic bluff, telling her they had surveillance footage of the intersection that proved she was lying. The weight of her secret, combined with this final push, was too much to bear. Smith broke down, dropping to her knees in a fit of hysterical crying, and finally confessed to the unthinkable. There was no carjacker. There was no kidnapping. She had eliminated her own children. She admitted that she had driven her Mazda to a boat ramp at John D. Long Lake, a quiet wooded spot just outside of town. With Michael and Alex still strapped into their car seats in the back, she got out, released the emergency brake, and let the car roll down the incline and into the dark water. Divers were dispatched to the lake and, after a search, located the vehicle submerged in 18 feet of water, much farther from the shore than they had initially expected. The scene inside the car was heartbreaking. The bodies of the two little boys were found dangling upside down in their car seats, one of their tiny hands forever pressed against a window. The confession transformed Smith from a figure of national sympathy into one of profound public contempt, a woman who would become one of America's most hated mothers. The subsequent trial in 1995 presented two starkly different portraits of Susan Smith, forcing the jury and the public to grapple with the complex question of her motive. The prosecution painted her as a selfish and manipulative woman who committed this act for a man. They argued that Smith was desperate to continue a relationship with Tom Findlay, the wealthy son of her boss, who had recently sent her a letter ending their affair. In that letter, Findlay had made it clear that he wasn't ready for a family and didn't want children. The prosecution contended that Smith saw her sons as the primary obstacle to the life and relationship she craved, and she made a horrific choice to eliminate them. In stark contrast, her defense team argued that this was not a case about evil, but one of despair and sadness. They presented a devastating portrait of a life marked by profound trauma and untreated mental illness. The jury heard about her dark history of trauma as a child, and psychiatrists testified that she suffered from major depression and a dependent personality disorder. The defense's theory was that Smith had driven to the lake that night, intending to end the entire family. However, in a final panicked moment, her body had literally willed itself out of the car as it rolled toward the water. When that's your defense, I think it's pretty safe to say you're beyond cooked. In July 1995, after deliberating for only 2.5 hours, the jury found Susan Smith guilty, to the surprise of no one. The prosecution passionately argued that she should be condemned, suggesting it would have been the expected verdict against the fictional black carjacker she created if he did it. They also noted that she had used the carjacker's supposed race to appeal to the prejudice of the public and the authorities, marking that as an aggravating factor. However, the defense's portrayal of her traumatic life was compelling enough to spare her. The jury sentenced her to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. Her time in prison has been troubled, marked by disciplinary issues including drug use and illicit relationships with prison guards. On November 20th, 2024, 30 years after her crimes, Smith appeared via video for her first parole hearing. In a tearful plea, she said she was sorry and that God had forgiven her. I suppose I'm reminded of that famous executioner's sword from medieval Germany that's engraved with a line that says, "When he lifts the sword, he wishes for eternal life for the sinner." What I'm saying is that I hate when I hear this sort of language. It's just a pure attempt by a sick individual to try to manipulate emotions. Unsurprisingly, her so-called remorse wasn't enough. Her ex-husband David was there to speak for the sons he lost, and the parole board unanimously denied her release. On the morning of June 20th, 2001, a 911 dispatcher in Houston, Texas, received a call from a woman named Andrea Yates. Her voice was eerily calm as she repeatedly requested a police officer but refused to explain why. When officers arrived at her suburban home, they found a scene of unimaginable horror. Inside, Andrea confessed immediately, telling them 4 of her children, John, age 5, Paul, 3, Luke, 2, and Mary, 6 months, were laid out on a bed in the master bedroom. Her eldest son, 7-year-old Noah, was still in the bathtub, floating face down. In the span of a single hour, between her husband leaving for work and her mother-in-law's expected arrival, Andrea had systematically drowned all 5 of her children. The act was methodical, deliberate, and so profoundly disturbing that it immediately seized the nation's attention. However, the true story of what happened is even more disturbing than you can possibly imagine. Despite the unimaginable horror that occurred, this wasn't an unexpected event by any means. It's a tale of an all-gas, no-brakes descent into madness, where all the guardrails seem to completely fail for both Andrea and her kids. Before she became a household name for the most tragic of reasons, Andrea had once been the picture of success. Born in Houston on July 2nd, 1964, she excelled in her youth, graduating as the valedictorian of her high school class and serving as captain of the swim team. She went on to earn a degree in nursing and worked as a highly regarded registered nurse at a Houston cancer center. In 1993, she married Rusty Yates, a NASA engineer, and soon after the birth of their first child in 1994, she left her career to become a full-time, homeschooling mother. The family's life was shaped by a deep commitment to a Christian ideology that emphasized having as many children as nature allowed. They lived for a time in unconventional settings, including a travel trailer and a converted bus, which contributed to a growing sense of isolation. Their beliefs were heavily influenced by the teachings of an itinerant preacher named Michael Waroniecki, who corresponded with the family. His sermons, which they consumed through letters and videos, preached that sinful mothers were doomed to raise sinful children who would go to hell. This doctrine appears to have intersected catastrophically with Andrea's developing mental illness, feeding a growing belief that she was a bad mother. This in turn meant that her children were consequently going to go to hell because of her personal failures. Andrea's descent into psychosis wasn't sudden, but a slow, agonizing unraveling that began years before the tragedy. She later reported having her first psychotic episode after the birth of her first son, Noah, in 1994, seeing visions of Satan but telling no one for fear the devil would harm her children. Her illness escalated dramatically after the birth of her 4th son, Luke, in 1999. That year, she attempted to end it all twice. These attempts led to her first psychiatric hospitalizations. During her time there, she was diagnosed with major depressive disorder with psychotic features, as well as postpartum psychosis. A devastating cycle began. She would be hospitalized, show rapid improvement on antipsychotic medication, and then be discharged, only to go off her medications. Doctors explicitly warned the couple that having more children would almost certainly trigger another, more severe psychotic episode. Despite these warnings, the couple conceived their 5th child just weeks after one of her hospital discharges. The birth of their daughter, Mary, in November 2000, followed by the sudden death of Andrea's father in March 2001, sent her into her final catastrophic breakdown. She became nearly catatonic, stopped eating, and read the Bible feverishly. Her delusions became all-consuming. She believed television cameras were monitoring her mothering, and believed Satan had entered her body. Most critically, she became convinced that her children were not developing righteously and were doomed to burn in hell because she had ruined them. Just weeks before the events, her psychiatrist discontinued her antipsychotic medication due to side effects. a decision that proved to be a fatal turning point. Andrea Yates's case resulted in two separate trials with two starkly different outcomes that revealed just how subjective the legal definition of insanity can be. In the first trial in 2002, prosecutors sought to give this mother an appointment with the chair. The case hinged on Texas's strict insanity law, which requires a defendant to prove they did not know their conduct was wrong. The prosecution argued that Andrea's methodical planning, waiting for her husband to leave, drowning the children one by one, proved she knew it was wrong. The defense countered that her severe psychosis made her believe her actions were not only right, but morally necessary to save her children from eternal damnation. They acknowledged that this was an extremely disturbing situation, but they claimed that in her mental framework, this was all very real. The trial took a decisive turn with the testimony of the prosecution's star expert witness, forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz. He told the jury that an episode of the show Law and Order, featuring a woman who drowned her children and was acquitted by reason of insanity, had aired shortly before the crime. The prosecution seized on this, suggesting in closing arguments that Andrea had mimicked the show to create a legal defense. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on all offenses. However, the story wasn't over. It was later discovered that this doctor's testimony was false, and no such Law and Order episode had ever aired. It's not even that a similar episode had aired at some point, it was that no such episode ever existed at all. In an age where you couldn't fact-check testimony in real time, her defense team apparently didn't realize this was false. That said, I'm going to criticize the defense harshly here regardless, because they didn't challenge the fact that the episode of the show wasn't entered into evidence. The prosecution, of course, ought to have disclosed this episode to the defense prior to the trial as well, if their expert intended to rely upon this evidence. I can't quite imagine that something so important to a case wasn't fully investigated by the prosecutors. In 2005, a Texas appeals court overturned the conviction, ruling that the false testimony was material and could have improperly influenced the jury. This paved the way for a retrial in 2006. The second trial was different in crucial ways. In the intervening years, extensive media coverage had also led to a national conversation about postpartum psychosis, creating a more informed public. With largely the same psychiatric evidence presented, the second jury deliberated for 13 hours and reached the opposite conclusion. Andrea Yates was not guilty by reason of insanity. Now, importantly, this doesn't mean what many people think it means. In fact, in many cases, insanity can lead to a much longer time essentially locked up. Following the 2006 verdict, Andrea Yates was committed to a state mental health facility. She was first sent to a high-security forensic psychiatric ward, and later, in 2007, to the lower-security Kerrville State Hospital. According to reports, she is now consistently medicated, and her attorney describes her as a woman who deeply grieves for her children. She has consistently waived her right to the annual hearings that could lead to her release. Hey everyone, it's Jimmy here reminding you to subscribe and hit the notification bell and turn on all those notifications. Also, if you feel like tossing a clam or two in my bucket, click the join link or the Patreon link in the description. With that said, let's get back to business. In the quiet, rolling hills of upstate New York, a young couple named Waneta and Tim Hoyt were living through an unimaginable nightmare. Between 1965 and 1971, they buried 5 of their children. First came Eric, then James and Julie, followed by Molly and Noah. One by one, they were laid to rest, each death a fresh wave of grief that left their small community heartbroken. For more than 20 years, their story was a medical tragedy, a case study in the cruel randomness of a newly understood condition. But a single decades-old medical paper held a clue to a different, more horrifying truth. This truth that would eventually reveal their story wasn't one of a tragic medical mystery at all. The pattern of death in the Hoyt household was as relentless as it was heartbreaking. It began in January 1965, when their firstborn, Eric, died at just 3 months old. 2 more children followed: James, born in 1966, and Julie, born in 1968. In September 1968, tragedy struck twice in 3 weeks. First, 48-day-old Julie died, and then 28-month-old James followed. 2 more children, Molly and Noah, were born in 1970 and 1971, respectively. Both also died within a few months of their birth. In each case, the cause of death was listed as SIDS, a diagnosis that, at the time, was shrouded in mystery and fear. Hoyt's crimes unfolded during a unique moment in medical history. The term was only formally introduced in 1969, following years of varied and often incorrect theories about why seemingly healthy infants perished in their sleep. It was a diagnosis of exclusion, applied when a thorough investigation and autopsy could find no other explanation. This lack of definitive knowledge created a diagnostic fog. For grieving parents, it offered a non-blaming explanation for an unbearable loss. For a predator like Waneta Hoyt, however, it provided the perfect cover. Her crimes coincided precisely with the period when the medical community had just enough knowledge to name the phenomenon, but not enough to distinguish it from a covert slaying. The Hoyt family's tragedy was so profound that it attracted the attention of Dr. Alfred Steinschneider, a pediatrician at Upstate Medical Center in Syracuse. The last 2 Hoyt babies, Molly and Noah, became subjects in his study. Waneta reported that the infants suffered from breathing difficulties, and they were admitted to the hospital for monitoring. Molly even became the first baby in the United States to be sent home with an apnea monitor. Despite this, both children perished shortly after being discharged. In October 1972, Dr. Steinschneider published his findings in the journal Pediatrics. The paper, which referred to the Hoyts only as Family H, proposed that SIDS could be caused by prolonged apnea and that this condition might run in families. The 5 Hoyt deaths served as the tragic proof of his hypothesis. The truth remained buried until 1985, when a prosecutor from a neighboring county, William Fitzpatrick, was working on an unrelated case with similar facts. He consulted with Dr. Linda Norton, a forensic pathologist from Dallas, who reviewed Steinschneider's 1972 paper. She saw something different in the data, not a medical anomaly, but a pattern of a predator. She gave Fitzpatrick a chilling warning. He might have a serial perpetrator in his area. The warning stayed with Fitzpatrick. When he was elected district attorney in 1992, he used his new authority to track down the anonymous Family H. He sent the case files to Dr. Michael Baden, a renowned forensic pathologist with the New York State Police. After reviewing the medical records and the autopsies of the exhumed remains, the physician's conclusion was unequivocal. Waneta Hoyt was a monster. In March 1994, investigators made their move. A state trooper who knew Waneta approached her at a post office and, using a clever ruse, he invited her to participate in a quote-unquote new research project on mothers who had been affected by SIDS. She agreed. During the subsequent interrogation, the friendly facade dropped, and under questioning, Waneta Hoyt confessed. She admitted to everything, and her motive was both shockingly simple and profoundly evil. The babies wouldn't stop crying, and she wanted to silence them. She described her methods in chilling detail, admitting she had used pillows, a bath towel, and the pressure of her own shoulder to smother them. Almost immediately, however, she recanted, claiming her confession was coerced. The validity of that confession became the central issue of her trial. The defense hired a forensic psychologist who concluded that Hoyt's dependent and avoidant personality disorders made her uniquely vulnerable to manipulative police tactics. Then, in a stunning development, even the prosecution's own psychiatric expert agreed that she was vulnerable and the police had manipulated her. The 1995 trial pitted two eras of science against each other. The prosecution, led by Fitzpatrick, built its case on Baden's modern forensic analysis and Hoyt's detailed confession. The defense countered with Dr. Steinschneider, who stood by his original SIDS diagnosis and argued that the confession was worthless. Prosecutors also speculated that Hoyt may have been suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy. This was a then-emerging psychological disorder in which a parent gains attention and sympathy through fabricated medical issues with a child. In April 1995, a jury found Waneta Hoyt guilty, and she was sentenced to 75 years to life in prison. But the story had one final bizarre twist. In August 1998, Hoyt died of pancreatic cancer before her appeal could be heard. Under New York law, because she died with her appeal still pending, her conviction was formally vacated. While a jury had declared her guilty, her legal record was officially wiped clean. Just dropping in once more, reminding you to share this video, subscribe, and check out my other content. Until next time, peace out.